The wind had been rising since late afternoon, carrying with it the metallic tang of a coming storm. Mara Halston felt it before she heard it, the shift in the air that settled on her skin like the touch of a cold hand. Out on the plains, storms didn't ask permission, they came howling, tearing across the land with a wild hunger that made even the toughest ranchers look to the sky and mutter a prayer. Mara watched the clouds thicken as she finished tying down the last shutter of her barn, the wood creaking as it met the hook. She stood there for a long moment, letting the rising wind whip loose strands of hair across her cheeks. She had lived here alone for nearly 3 years. Long enough for solitude to become less an enemy and more a quiet companion. Long enough for her to forget the sound of another human breathing in the same room. Long enough to learn that silence could be both comforting and terrifying, depending on the day. The prairie stretched around her in every direction, endless grass rippling in the wind like a restless sea. Her farmhouse sat at the heart of it, weathered but sturdy, a small mark of persistence in a world that tried its best to erase whatever stood still for too long. She had repaired every roof plank, every fence post, every cracked board with her own hands. That house was more than walls, it was a promise she had made to herself after her husband fell to the ravine. A promise that she would not fold. The first raindrop hit her cheek as she reached her porch. She wiped it away absently, boots thudding against the aged wood as she stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of dried sage and firewood. She hung her coat, closed the door, and laid her rifle across the table. Nights like these made her uneasy, not because she feared storms but because storms carried travelers. And lately, travelers had carried trouble. She lit the lantern on the table, the flame catching with a soft bloom of warm light that pushed away the edges of the dark. Shadows danced along the walls, trembling with each gust of wind rattling the farmhouse. Mara poured herself a cup of strong tea, hands wrapped around the warm metal to chase away the chill. The knock came just as she took the first sip. It wasn't the timid tap of a lost drifter or the heavy pounding of someone desperate for shelter. It was a measured, controlled rap. 3 taps, a pause, then 2 more, like someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Mara's hand froze around the cup. She set it down slowly, quietly, before reaching for the rifle. She moved toward the door with deliberate calm, each step soft but certain. The lantern cast a soft halo around her, but the rest of the house remained shadowed, as if holding its breath. She stopped a few feet from the door and waited. The knock came again, firmer this time. Mara spoke evenly, loud enough to be heard through the wood, though her voice carried no tremor. She asked who was there. The reply came slow, low, and unmistakably familiar. A voice from her past, from before the whispers, before the strangers began prowling her land asking the wrong questions. She didn't open the door. Not yet. Instead, she pressed her shoulder lightly against it, listening to the storm building behind him. He told her she would regret keeping him out. The words were meant as a warning, not a threat. She heard the difference. She also heard something else in the spaces between his breaths. Exhaustion, strain, a kind of restrained urgency she had only heard once before, on the night he came to her barn bleeding from a gunshot that wasn't meant for him. Memories pressed at her but she shoved them aside. She opened the small viewing slot carved into the door and peered out. The storm's edge had reached him already. His had dripped steady lines of water down his coat. Mud caked the lower edges of his boots and the travel dust that once coated him had turned to streaks of mud. Lightning flashed behind him, giving his eyes a momentary glint like polished steel. He looked at her with something complicated tightening his jaw. He stepped closer to the door, telling her she didn't understand what was happening on the plains. She replied that she understood enough. She understood that dangerous men had been searching for him for months. She understood that those same men had come to her ranch asking where he had gone. She understood that trouble had a habit of following him like a persistent shadow. Lightning cracked again, the sound tearing across the field a moment later like the rip of a giant drum. Mara could feel her pulse quicken, though not from fear. It was something else she didn't care to name. He shifted his weight, boots sinking deeper into the growing mud. He asked her again to open the door. Not with anger, not with force, but with a tone that carried the weight of miles traveled and dangers lurking so close she could almost feel them pressing against the walls of her house. She saw the tightness around his eyes. The way he scanned the darkness behind him before looking at her. The way he kept one hand pressed to his side as if he were hiding an injury or a secret. She had known him before the trouble. Before the name whispered in saloons. Before the hunters came looking. Before the planes began humming with dangers she wished she could ignore. He had once helped her through the aftermath of her husband's death, quietly repairing her barn roof without being asked, quietly fixing her fence while saying little more than a handful of words. He had been a man who didn't ask for anything in return. And maybe that was why it was hard to look at him now, soaked, mud-covered, catching his breath against her door like a man running from ghosts he didn't have time to explain. But Mara Halston had rebuilt herself from ashes. She had learned that letting someone in, physically or otherwise, was a choice weighted with consequences she would be forced to carry alone once they were gone again. He said her name through the crack in the door, voice low, pulling her back from her thoughts. Not pleading, just saying it, as though the name itself might be enough to unlock whatever wall stood between them. For a moment, she almost opened the door. Almost, but almost was not enough. Instead, she met his gaze through the narrow slot. The storm raged louder now, wind howling like an animal. Her lantern flickered. The farmhouse creaked with every gust. She told him dangers had come to her door long before he arrived. That she didn't need saving. That solitude had carved her into something steadier than fear. He shook his head, rain running down his cheek like a thin silver trail. He told her this wasn't about her being afraid. It was about something coming across the plains that neither of them would want to face alone. Something ruthless, something determined, something close. The wind slammed hard against the door. Mara didn't move. He stepped forward, close enough that she could see the faint bruise at the corner of his jaw. He lowered his voice again, telling her if she closed the door now, she wouldn't have time to undo it. Not because he meant harm, but because the storm wasn't the only thing closing in. Thunder groaned across the sky like a wounded beast. Mara felt the weight of the moment press against her chest. She had been alone so long that another presence, especially his, cut through her like a blade through thick brush. She studied him carefully, searching for deception, for danger, for anything that might justify opening or closing. The door, she found only weariness and urgency. In something she refused to name. She smirked, small and subtle, the kind of smirk born from someone who had survived too much to be shaken by warnings. She had seen threats come and go. She had seen grief that hollowed people out. She had seen the worst storms and outlasted them. Her hand moved to the bolt. His eyes widened, not in fear, but in realization of her choice. In one slow, deliberate motion, she slid the bolt fully into place, the metal locking with a sharp, final thud. The sound cut through the storm like a line drawn in the dirt. The wind howled harder, rattling the shutters, shaking the door. But the bolt held. Mara stepped back from the door, spine straight, breath steady. She didn't look through the slot again. Outside, she heard him curse under his breath, not in anger, but in frustration and grim acceptance. She heard his boots shift in the mud. She heard the storm swallow his silhouette as lightning split the sky once more. But she didn't open the door. Not yet. She stood in the dim lantern light, the shadows trembling around her, and felt the weight of the coming night settle deep into her bones. Whatever was coming across the plains, whatever hunted him, whatever had driven him to her door. She was ready. She had survived worse, and solitude had taught her that some doors must close before the truth can force them open again.